In a surprise move announced on April 19, 2024, China disbanded its Strategic Support Force and established a new Information Support Force. This reorganization affects how the PLA manages information, cyber, and space capabilities that are increasingly critical for modern warfare. How should we understand these PLA reforms? And how will these changes affect the PLA's long-term strategic planning? Joining us for our discussion today is Dr. Joel Wasnow. Dr. Wasnow is a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. His research areas include Chinese foreign and security policy, Chinese military affairs, U.S.-China relations, and strategic developments in East Asia. Dr. Wasnow also serves as an adjunct professor in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Prior to joining NDU, Dr. Wasnow was a China analyst at CNA, a postdoctoral fellow in the China and the World program at Princeton University, and a predoctoral fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Wasnow holds an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University, an MPhil in Modern Chinese Studies from Oxford University, and a PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. Thank you for joining us, Joel. So I'd like to start off with the basic question of what happened with the Strategic Support Force. We've seen a lot of reporting on the new reorganization. Could you share with us the major changes that you're seeing?
Thanks. So there's basically two major changes going on right now with the Strategic Support Force, or the former Strategic Support Force. The first is that they have eliminated the headquarters, right? So the Strategic Support Force has a lot of different subordinate units. They're responsible for space and cyber and psychological warfare and electronic warfare. So it's a very large, wide-ranging, varied organization. Those operational units are all still there. What they did in the first instance was to break up, to dissolve the headquarters. So the management layer is gone, leaving only the actual operational units in place. And so those are now all reporting directly up to the Central Military Commission, which is the high command led by Xi Jinping. So no more middle management layer, so to speak. So that's kind of change number one. The second change is creating sort of a new organization that's called the Information Support Force. Again, not fundamentally new. This has been sort of recombined from pre-existing units in the PLA, but they put those together. They created a new name for them, and they are called now the Information Support Force. And so that will sit alongside the Aerospace Force, the Cyberspace Force, and the Joint Logistics Support Force as a group of 4 support forces for the PLA, all of which now are going to report directly up to the Central Military Commission. So again, it's not the creation of new units or new operational forces. It's sort of a move in the lane of decentralizing them, but also placing them more in a kind of direct chain of command. So the key thing, again, removing that middle layer and creating this new information support force. So it's a bureaucratic change, not a fundamental movement to hire new troops or to add some capability that they lack before. It's more of a management change.
And Joel, how do these 3 new support forces, the Information Support Force, the Aerospace Force, and the Cyber Force, compare to our existing forces or how we operate in the United States? So for example, when I hear the Aerospace Force, the first thing that comes to my mind is this similar to our Space Force?
Yeah, so I should clarify the Aerospace Force and the Cyberspace Force are carryovers. So they are not themselves new. They were part of the Strategic Support Force, but they have already existed for several years. The only real new piece here is this so-called Information Support Force. There is some parallel, I think, with the U.S. system and with other, the Russians or other major militaries. The Aerospace Force in particular for China China has a broader mandate. It would sort of combine functions that are purely military, so operating military reconnaissance satellites and doing some counter space missions, but they also would combine sort of civil space functions like NASA would handle in terms of space launch and sort of dealing with their satellites, the lunar program, the deep space exploration and all of that. It's all really housed within the PLA. So they don't really have a civilian space function. And so that's why the Ministry of National Defense, when they announced all of this, when they talked about the aerospace force, they really highlighted that civil space mission. They didn't want to say a single thing about, this as an offensive space force or a, counter space capability. They didn't want to talk about that. But of course, they have that. The cyberspace force would be somewhat similar to our cyber command or perhaps our national security agency. So they are doing basically offensive cyber missions. They're trying to gain access to computer networks in other countries for the purpose of espionage, whether it's economic espionage or political or military. So they're doing that, but then they're also trying to gain access to potentially disrupt computer networks in the event of a conflict. So that's very much a warfighting purpose that the cyberspace force has. And then finally, the information support force. There isn't an exact parallel, I think, in the US system for this group. There is somewhat of a connection with our Defense Information Systems Agency or DISA, but they are much more on the defensive side. They are maintaining computer networks and communication systems for the PLA. They are more of a systems resilience organization. They may also have a bit of a space mission in terms of having some role with the space communication satellites, but they are more, how do you protect the PLA's own communication? So there is a function in the US system. It's not exactly called a force, but it is obviously it's an important function for any modern military to do that. And they have created from different existing units this new ISF that aims to do that. So, again, there are certainly some parallels. They almost certainly did take the US model and the Russians and perhaps some of the Europeans and other Asian militaries for reference value. And so that's why I think the new system looks a bit more like foreign models than it used to.
Thank you, Joel. That's very helpful for folks to understand China's new structure and how that compares to that of the United States. Before moving on, I'd like to clarify some terminology with you. So when China's Ministry of National Defense released information about these changes, it emphasized that China is now constructing a new system of military services and arms with 4 services and 4 arms. But you've been using the term support force instead of arms. So could you share with us how you assess the difference between services and arms and why you're using the term support force?
Well, the terminology that the Chinese are using in English is confusing because when we say arms, we're sort of thinking about a branch of a service, but that's not really the case here. So what they're doing is they are differentiating between the 4 military services, which are the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Rocket Force on one hand, and 4 support forces. I wouldn't call them arms because it's confusing. They're really 4 support forces, which again are the aerospace, the cyberspace, the information support, and the joint logistics support forces. So the thing that really differentiates these are the responsibilities that they have. So for the services, they are pretty much like our services insofar as their main role is to prepare forces that are used by joint commanders. So the PLA services, they will recruit, they train, they educate, they organize forces, they make them as ready as possible. But then when they're used in wartime or in an emergency, they are sort of handed over to a theater commander or possibly a task force commander to use in a joint fashion. So it's what in our system we call a Title 10 responsibility, man, train, and equip. That's what the services do. The support forces, however, have a broader mandate. So they also will recruit and train and educate people to perform certain missions. But the main difference is that they actually, in their own right, conduct operations. So the cyberspace force, they actually go out and do the hacking. The Space Force, they launch the satellites and they maintain the satellites and so on. The ISF, they handle the communications, and the logistics troops, they actually will do logistics operations as they did back in 2020 during the pandemic when they were mobilized to lead operations. So that's really the main distinction here, is that the services are sort of Title 10. The support forces are that plus operations. But ultimately speaking, if we're thinking about a large war or a major contingency of some type, troops both from the services and the support forces would be brought together under a theater commander. So the PLA, also just to add some more confusion into this, they have 5 theater commands. So the Eastern Theater Command, they all are geographically aligned, but the Eastern Theater Command is responsible for Taiwan and so on. And so those theater commanders would draw from the services, but also draw from the support forces to develop the capabilities that they would need to undertake their missions in a joint fashion. And so, again, the PLA is delineating between the services and the support forces, but both of them are contributing to broader missions that would be led by the theaters and ultimately up by the Central Military Commission. So, hope that it's sort of a convoluted picture, but hope that helps to clarify a little bit.
Thanks, Joel. One more question in terms of structure and organization. Where are these 3 support forces located? Is there one central location, or are they located throughout the 5 theater commands and subordinate to the theater commands?
Yeah, so in terms of where they're actually located, they are distributed across the country. So just for example, the Joint Logistics Support Force, which is one of these support forces, they do have bases that are within the 5 theater commands. So they're not all, sort of centrally located in one place in China. They're distributed. However, in peacetime, those forces, right, so those logistics troops in this example, they do not actually report to the theater command headquarters. And so it's sort of an odd situation wherein if you are the Eastern Theater Commander, your job is to prepare for cross-strait operations. And yet, in a normal situation in peacetime, you don't actually have a logistics component. That's a separate chain of command that goes up to the national level. And you have to ask. You have to ask permission to use those things. And so occasionally you will see support forces, so logistics or cyber or space, you might see them occasionally brought into a theater exercise because they need to do that. They need to have some level of interoperability in order to conduct their planning, their training, and to reduce frictions that they're going to roll into a wartime situation. But the normal peacetime chain of command doesn't actually go through the theaters. So that's with respect to the support forces. The services are somewhat different because the units of the services, right? So in the Army, the group armies or, the naval flotillas or the Air Force bases, they operate in a dual chain of command. So they report administratively up to the service headquarters, right? So again, the service headquarters themselves play no operational role, but their subordinate units, they report administratively up to the service headquarters, which are in Beijing. But then they also report operationally up to the theater commands. And so that's an important shift as part of the 2015-2016 reforms, because you do have with the services this kind of dual chain of command. So what that means in practice is if you are the Eastern Theater Commander, you can tell the Air Force units within your area of responsibility what to do in peacetime. Prior to 2015, there was a single chain of command insofar as those naval units or Air Force units, they had no connection at all to the military regions, which were the forerunners of the theater commands. And so those forces, those flotillas or those air squadrons, they would take operational guidance from their service headquarters. So Xi Jinping, the reformers, about now almost 10 years ago, they realized that was just totally inefficient. The military regions and now the theater commands, they need to be able to train regularly with troops that they oversee. They have to be able to develop, joint training programs and contingency plans and conduct operations and even coercive operations. And so the chain of command now operationally is that they have to actually have oversight over those units. But what they don't have is oversight over the support forces. The support forces are still national assets. They maybe don't have enough of those things to give to each of the theater commanders, or they're scarce resources that need to be held fairly closely at the center. And so the chain of command there is that, you have those things. Again, they're geographically distributed, but the theater commander still has to ask permission to use them. And so if we're talking again about a Taiwan contingency, that's a huge operation. You need space surveillance and you need cyber hackers and all of this. And so in that situation, that theater commander would have to be given control over all four of those support forces to be able to conduct the war. And so you're still going to have a transition from peacetime to wartime operations in which those scarce national resources are moved from central command to theater command. And so that's a point of friction. Now, for the PLA, as they contemplate, potentially moving from a peacetime into crisis and into wartime.
Related to the chain of command, you mentioned earlier that one of the major changes was the elimination of the former Strategic Support Force headquarters, and that a layer of management is now gone. But when you look at the new leaders that had the three new organizations or the three new support forces, to what extent are you seeing similar leadership as before? And are there completely new leaders in each of the new support forces?
Right. So for the aerospace and cyberspace forces, they haven't received any new leadership. It's the current people who were there before. The information support force is new, and so they have a new leadership. The political commissar was the political commissar of the strategic support force. And so that person, he needed a new job. And so this is his new job, even though it's a little bit of a demotion for him. And the commander of the information support force was previously one of the deputy commanders of the strategic support force. And so they handpicked him. He doesn't seem to have a lot of experience, sort of technical experience with communications, but he does have a career of experience with joint operations. And one of his previous roles or assignments was in the Central Military Commission's Training and Administration Department, which is responsible for joint training and thinking through joint doctrine. So the skill set that he brings is not that he knows necessarily all the ins and outs of the PLA's communications systems, but he knows how joint operations work. And he is pretty well aware, I would imagine, that communication support for theater commanders is really essential. Now, the other bit here with the leadership of the SSF and now the Information Support Force is really, just to avoid any confusion here, this is not like what has gone on a few months ago with the PLA Rocket Force, where you had a wholesale departure of their senior leadership, the commander, the political commissar, all the deputies. I mean, so they took out the entire leadership of the Rocket Force back over the summer. And this was also connected with the Li Shangfu scandal. And so that was clearly a sign that there was a purge happening in the Rocket Force. So it's as if Xi Jinping lost confidence in everybody. There was probably some major corruption scandal happening there. That's not the case here with this former strategic support force. Only the commander of the strategic support force, we don't know what's going on with him. He's been cited of late. It doesn't seem that he's been purged, but it's not clear what his current position is. But most of the rest of the people there are still active. And so that's kind of a signal of that. Most likely the reason for this reorganization was to improve management, as opposed to they were concerned that people were corrupt and they're trying to get rid of like a cohort of officers because no one was reliable. So that doesn't seem to be the case, although it's sort of tempting to want to connect those two things, but the evidence doesn't seem to point to a connection here between the Rocket Force scandal and the SSF reorganization.
And in terms of why China is implementing these changes, you mentioned earlier it's likely to improve the management and improve the ability of these forces to conduct operations. But as you look at the changes within the former Strategic Support Force and the leadership purge that you referenced within the rocket force. Adding all of these together, are these indicators that China is seeking to accelerate its ambitious military modernization goals?
Well, my sense here is that they were dissatisfied with the management of the SSF, that it was too top heavy, too inefficient, and they weren't getting enough of a clear picture on what was actually happening with the space, the cyberspace, the communications, and the psyops, and all the different disciplines within information warfare. That the central leadership wasn't getting enough of a picture, that there was a lot of excess baggage there that was kind of dragging things and slowing things down. There is an alternative possibility here, which is that the SSF was designed back in 2015 as an incubator of these forces, that they were all sort of fledgling and they needed a bit of higher level guidance, and now they're ready to kind of spread their wings and take flight. But I don't think there's really any precedent for the PLA ever creating an organization in advance just to have it be demolished at some point in the future. I think it's, to me, more likely that it just wasn't a system that was working very well. Now, it also asks, the question of the timing of this. So why 9 years later have they decided to conduct this reorganization? I don't think we have a good explanation currently from the PLA as to why they did this now. One possibility that's worth considering, though, is that they are trying to absorb lessons from, current ongoing conflicts around the world and what's working and what's not working for others. So specifically with the Russian case, the Russians did not handle communications well at all. To be more specific, when the Russians went into Ukraine, they didn't have the communication systems on their own, and they had to leave a lot of Ukraine's communications infrastructure active. And so the cell phone towers and all of that, because the Russians were using that. I mean, what that meant, though, is that the Russians became vulnerable to being targeted. And so they lost a lot of generals who were operating up on the battlefield. But anyway, the Russian case was sort of indicative to the Chinese that you had better get this communications situation correct. You need to handle this. And that probably means a higher level of an organization than what existed in the past, which was just a base. And so now they've created an entire force to make sure that PLA forces, wherever they're operating, have stable, have secure, resilient communications, because, they've seen very clearly that those things are going to be attacked by adversaries in any conflict. And if those things go down, then that's a big problem for your joint operations. And so my speculation is that they are taking some pages out of the Russian sort of playbook or the Russian failure. And that has been a bit of a wake-up call for them. And so that, I think, can help explain the timing of the information support force. So, it doesn't speak, I think, to a different fundamental doctrine or a accelerated military modernization or accelerated, timeframes for a war. I don't think you can take that. I think you can take this as more of a sign that they are dissatisfied with their current structure. It wasn't flexible enough, and they didn't pay enough attention, especially to the communications, and to figure out, well, there's a new solution, and the US has a model for how to do this. The Russians have sort of a negative model how not to do this, and they're sort of absorbing all of these lessons and trying to experiment with their own system. And this for service, for support force model is what they have come up with. And so that's my best estimate as to why they've done this and why they've done it now.
I want to follow up on your references to what China's learning from Russia. But before that, you mentioned the Information Support Force's transition from a base to entire force. This might be too early to tell, but does this mean that the Information Support Force will grow in size and personnel?
Well, I don't know that there is an increase in terms of the manpower. I do think there has been an elevation in terms of the leadership of the communications. So previously, they were within the Joint Staff Department as just sort of a bureau. Then they moved over to the SSF as a base. Now their status is as a force. And so if you think about this, they are now basically a 3-star command with a 3-star level commander. And they're on the same, sort of bureaucratic plane as the logistics troops, the space and the cyber troops, with a direct chain of command up to the Central Military Commission. So their status is higher, their visibility is higher. That may allow them to build a larger staff structure in their headquarters to make sure that things are working, although it's not clear. I mean, most likely they're in the phase now of developing their internal plans and what they want their headquarters to look like. And, whether or not that will lead to, further investment in actual communications hardware or, specialized troops that are actually responsible for that, I think right now remains to be seen. But they are in a better position now, I think, to demand resources and to be able to provide, inputs into the joint planning process and to receive guidance from the CMC than in the past. So it's certainly a sign of a priority that this particular skill set matters. What we're going to have to look for in the future is, in their joint exercises, to what extent is the PLA actually mobilizing these capabilities, not just the information, the communications people, but all the support forces? Are they making better use of these capabilities, or are they still more or less siloed? And I think that will be the major test here to evaluate whether this reorganization is successful. It's not just, a matter of changing the line and block charts or, changing the bureaucratic grade of the commands. It's how well are you actually coordinating these support forces with the end users, which are for the most part, the theater commands. And if they're not doing that in peacetime, then you still have this major friction point as you go into warfare, because you're dealing with units that don't know each other very well and people who don't know each other. And so I think that will be the test, and that will be the thing to look for, here as we go out in the next several years is, does this new 4+4 structure mean that those theater commanders are developing better plans, are engaged in larger, more sophisticated exercises, and ultimately, as they are planning and they're doing sort of coercive operations, are things coming together more seamlessly and with less friction? So I think that's really where the rubber will meet the road, and that's really what we need to look for.
Joel, you mentioned China learning from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that potentially impacting China's decision to invest in more resilient and independent communication capabilities. But as you look at the changes that we're seeing now in China, did you have any indication before the April announcements that China was about to engage in this change? And if it was indeed motivated by Russian operations in Ukraine, does this timeline of the PLA engaging in a key reform within 2 years of drawing lessons learned from a foreign war showcase that the PLA can readily adapt and can quickly learn from developments happening internationally?
Well, I don't think we had a great indication that they were planning this. This seemed to come out of almost nowhere. It could be that people kind of in the know who were tracking the SSF very carefully, maybe saw some signs of this. But I think for the most part, this was not announced and it was sort of rolled out, and, it was sort of a done deal. So it was different from the PLA reorganization, the big one that took place in 2015, 2016. Because in that situation, the Central Military Commission had a meeting. They announced the principles and basically the outline of the reforms. They said, this is the schedule through which we are going to make important changes. And they pretty much followed it. I mean, they were a couple of years behind schedule, but there was a timeline. And so we weren't taken by surprise when they did certain things back in that time frame. But this was not part of any plan that I'm aware of that was publicly discussed or announced by the CMC or by the party leadership. And so this seems to be more improvisational, as if they sort of discovered that there was a problem. They thought about it and they said, well, there is an alternative and we need to, implement this relatively quickly in order to have the systems in place that will be necessary to train for, major combat operations. And so I think, to me, that's sort of what happened. Now, again, there is this sort of alternative hypothesis that there was a plan all along to upgrade, to create something like an information support force. And I give credit actually to colleagues John Costello and Joe McReynolds, wrote a monograph on the SSF back in around 2017 or 2018 for us at NDU. And they looked at this kind of information support piece of it, which had to do with sort of network defense and comms. And they said, well, at some point, this could be upgraded. This could be, the origins of a future. And I think they actually used the phrase information support force. So, they sort of saw, or they had a very good prophetic mindset to say, look, this is something that the PLA probably needs and they may eventually have. But, that was years ago, and it really has taken them quite some time to get there. So again, it's hard to say that there was a clear internal plan all along, for the last decade to do this. It seems like they probably absorbed some lessons from Ukraine on this score relatively quickly. It doesn't necessarily mean that the machine will adjust itself or adapt in all areas quickly, or that they're even taking the right lessons in all areas out of Ukraine. But in this one, my speculation is that they saw a very clear problem, and then they moved rather quickly to try to fix it.
Great, thank you. I want to transition now to discussing what are the implications of these changes. There's been a lot of reporting and a lot of speculation, with some analysts arguing that this restructuring within the PLA could allow China to embrace a more offensive military posture. What is your sense? You suggested already that these changes are mainly to increase efficiency and effectiveness. But from your perspective, how do these changes impact China's overall military posture? And how will it change how China may operate moving forward?
Well, it was interesting that some of the headlines around this story were referencing like a shift towards information warfare, but I think that was misleading because, the PLA already valued information warfare. They understood that in order to succeed in modern combat, you need to be able to dominate in the information domain. And so what that means operationally is that your own forces need to be able to hear, to communicate, to listen, to sense. And what you want to do is to try to deprive your adversary of those same sensing capabilities. So that was already very, very clearly enunciated in PLA doctrine. And the question is really organizationally, what's the best way to get there? And so, when we looked at the strategic support force years ago, that seemed to be sort of an all, clearinghouse for information warfare capabilities. So everything that had to do with information was sort of melded together in this one organization. But at the end of the day, it seemed not to have been necessary to create that overarching bureaucratic structure. The space guys are doing space things, right? The cyber guys are doing cyber things. And you don't necessarily have to have a huge amount of synergy between all of those different separate disciplines. So the PLA got information warfare. This recent change, this demolishment of the SSF and the creation of the ISF, it doesn't mean that the PLA is now thinking, oh, how do we conduct information warfare? It's really how do we do this most efficiently within the context of our theater joint operations command system. And so having the system of four forces, kind of three of which are relevant to information, one of which is relevant to logistics, that's the model that they are currently experimenting with. But again, the main change here, other than demolishing the SSF headquarters, is creating a higher level command for communication. So that seems to be the thing in terms of posturing themselves for success in a future conflict, whether it's, with Taiwan or the United States or otherwise. But having those really stable, secure, reliable, redundant communications and having confidence that that stuff's going to work to be able to coordinate your forces that are operating across vast distances and, to improve interoperability between different kinds of forces. I think that mission has gained a higher level of interest and priority, perhaps, by the leadership. And so the result of this could be that they are better postured, better able to succeed where Russia failed. But again, to sort of reiterate, you can't just do an organizational change. You have to blend this into your doctrine, and you have to work this in very effectively into your routine training exercises. And if they're not doing that, then this might be less effective than it would seem at first glance.
So you mentioned the importance China has placed on information. Is there also greater importance being placed on space and cyber, given the designation of the prior aerospace and cyberspace units as now support forces?
I wouldn't say that there's more importance on these functions. They haven't been bureaucratically elevated. So there's still kind of 3-star level commands. I think what this will do, or at least perhaps it is intended to do, is to give the high command, so Xi Jinping and his top generals, more visibility into the actual operations and the modernization. So it could be, sort of a supervision and control improvement, but I don't think that they will have, a greater play for resources or their status has somehow been enhanced. But it also raises the question of, well, now you have a chain of command that's cleaner, meaning that there is this middle layer, it's been removed. But how much time, how much attention can Xi Jinping and the 6 generals on the Central Military Commission really pay to any of these individual problems? First of all, so it's something we would call a span of control problem. Xi Jinping himself is not just the boss of the military. I mean, he is the boss of China. He has a million things that he has to be responsible for. So how much time during his week can he really spend on the PLA in general? And within the PLA, how much time can he really spend on logistics or information or Air Force or anything else? It's probably, realistically speaking, a very, very small amount of time. And then for the military brass, it's also a span of control issue for them, because even within the Central Military Commission, you have 15 departments that report to the CMC itself. So 15, everything from auditing to training to the political work system. They have a huge amount of responsibilities in terms of managing and supervising. And now they have not this SSF, but they have 3 forces that previously were under the SSF. So now they have to get reports from 3 different new organizations. So it's a massive span of control problem. And so you kind of wonder, how effectively that staffing is going to work. And so, who's going to be briefing these people? How much knowledge, how much expertise will Xi Jinping and his top generals even have to ask the right questions and to give useful directives down to any of these forces? I think that's, really an issue that they're going to have to face here. And so if they think they have cleaned up the chain of command and made things simpler, more efficient, and improved, the management, that might be what they intended. I'm not sure it's exactly what they're going to get. And so I think that a lot of that is going to depend not on the leadership itself, but on the entire staff process through which briefings are being teed up for Xi and his generals, and information is being collected, and and directives are being well thought out and passed back on down to those forces. So there's a lot of unknown there about how efficient all of that system is. But if it's just occasional, Xi Jinping needs to know about what the Space Force is doing, I don't know exactly how that specifically is going to benefit the efficiency of their planning or their operations.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me wrap up this podcast with one final set of questions for you. Do these changes to the former Strategic Support Force foreshadow that there may be other major future changes within the PLA? And given the lack of information regarding these reforms prior to their implementation, how much can we know in advance, and what should we be watching for as we move forward?
Well, I think what this episode tells us is that, we're not necessarily going to have a lot of foresight into, major organizational changes in the PLA. It's not as if they're always going to have some plan and then they roll it out over many years. They are free to do what they want to their organization. They don't have to go through Congress and have all these different checks and balances. If they want to make a change, then they're going to, they can act potentially rather quickly to do it. As for other parts of the PLA that might be the subject to change, I don't think we know that right now. One thing that I've speculated about is whether or not the lessons from Ukraine could indicate, potential reevaluation of how their ground forces are structured. And so, the specific issue there is that the Russians had this move towards brigades and battalions, which are smaller, lighter, more mobile, ground force structure. But then they threw those units into Ukraine and they didn't have enough support and they did very badly. And so the Russians have started to move back to divisions and, huge, heavier organizational formations. But the PLA went totally all in on that lighter brigade battalion model. And so do they think that's actually going to be sufficient, given that, for example, Taiwan has a lot of, anti-tank weapons and anti-air and so on? And so will the PLAs maybe make some changes like the Russians have done to their ground forces? So that's just one possibility. But whether or not they're satisfied or dissatisfied, sometimes I think we'll only know in retrospect what the story was with that. Now, the last bit is kind of what to look for in the future. Is this all kind of coming together? Well, as I said earlier, I think the main thing will be, how is this executed in training? We have, glimpses and bits and pieces based on what, the PLA actually reports about its exercises, who was involved, what units were involved, who led the exercise, and so if you see the, support forces, the four of them or any one of them being involved regularly in those publicly announced exercise, and that's a sign that the system is starting to gel. The educational piece. So are they operating their own training programs or universities? Are they recruiting directly, or are they simply borrowing troops from other parts of the PLA on a temporary basis? The leadership, who are they appointing into positions? Do those leaders have relevant expertise, or do they not? The doctrine. So as we get more publications out of the PLA on what their updated doctrine looks like, does it actually reference this 4+4 model and explain in terms of the operational regulations what each of these are supposed to be doing to support the joint commander of the theaters and so on? Those would be some of the milestones to look for to see if reform is actually deepening. It doesn't mean if we don't see, some of those changes, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that they're not doing it. But, it could be that they're doing it to some degree outside of public view. But to get sort of positive evidence that this is starting to work and they're starting to actually improve the way they're doing business, those would be some of the, sort of some of the observable signs that I think we will want to be looking for over the next few years.